Welcome back to Geology of the National Parks. This is the Topic 2 lecture for Week 7 on desert environments, with a special feature on Death Valley National Park. We're going to start off with the basics. What is a desert? A desert is any land that is so extremely arid that vegetation covers less than 15% of its surface, and particularly an area where annual rainfall or precipitation amounts to less than 10 inches. In this picture down below, we can see the salt pan on the floor of Death Valley National Park, which is located on the border of California and Nevada. By looking at this picture, we can see an extremely arid and barren landscape, with next to no vegetation visible. In this desert, the landscape consists mostly of sediments. In the foreground, we have rock salt. In the middle ground, we have loose alluvium sediments that have been deposited by flash floods coming off of the mountains in the background, which are mostly composed of bare, exposed rock. Globally, deserts cover about 1/3 of the Earth's land surface. Most of these are located in particular areas around the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. Some of the big deserts include the Sahara, the world's largest desert, the Arabian Desert, the Great Sandy Desert or the Great Australian Desert, the Gobi Desert, the Turkestan Desert, and in the North American area, the Sonoran, Chihuahuan, and Great Basin deserts are our large deserts. There are two main categories of deserts. There are those caused by global air circulation, subtropical deserts and polar deserts, and there are deserts caused by rain shadow effects, which we call rain shadow deserts. Death Valley, seen here on the right, is located in a rain shadow desert. Subtropical deserts and polar deserts are both due to global air circulation. Subtropical deserts include the Sahara, Arabia, Namib, Great Australian, Great Basin, Sonoran, and Chihuahuan deserts. On the map in the lower left, the orange areas represent these subtropical deserts. This map in the upper right details some of the larger and most important deserts in the American Southwest, including the Sacramento Desert, the Chihuahuan Desert, the Sonoran Desert, the Colorado Desert, and the Mojave Desert. These subtropical deserts are caused by global air circulation, where we have cool, dry air descending from the upper atmosphere around 30 degrees latitude, both in the northern and southern hemispheres. The atmospheric circulation currents, called Hadley cells, control the global flow of air from the hot equator to the cold poles. These cells circulate air all around the planet. Warm, moist air will rise from the equator. Then cool, dry air sinks back down towards the surface at around 30 degrees latitude, both north and south. And this contributes to high pressure and low moisture, which contributes to dry climate in those latitudes. This also creates global bands of deserts at about 30 degrees latitude, which, as I showed on the map, are present in North America, South America, Africa, and Asia. Cold, dry air also sinks around the north and south poles, which gives rise to our polar deserts. Now, we don't have any national parks in polar deserts, but Antarctica and the Arctic are indeed deserts with very, very low rainfall. There are parts of Antarctica, for example, pictured here, called the dry valleys, where there is no ice cover, no precipitation, and some of the coldest and most arid climates anywhere on the planet. The McMurdo Dry Valleys, as this region is called, is actually a very good approximation of certain areas of the Martian climate, albeit with substantially more atmosphere to breathe. Now we move on to rain shadow deserts. It's important to know that warm air holds more moisture than cold air. As warm, wet air masses that come off of the ocean typically are forced over mountains, that air mass will cool, and as it cools, the water vapor trapped in the air will condense and drop moisture as precipitation on what we call the windward side of the mountain. This effect is called orographic lift, where warm, cool air is forced upward, and as it does that, it expands, cools down, and drops out all of its moisture. This leaves behind packages of colder, drier air that sinks down on the leeward side, warming up as it falls down and promoting evaporation on the surface of the leeward side of the mountains. This creates deserts in the rain shadow of the mountain. The rain gets trapped on the windward side of the mountains and only very rarely makes it over the mountains to drop rain in the desert side, so we call that area the rain shadow. Death Valley lives in one of the world's great rain shadows. As seen in this topographical profile from the Pacific Ocean on the west to Death Valley on the east, we can see that air rising from the Pacific Ocean, which is warm and moist, humid that is, has to go over the California coastal ranges, which creates their own minor rain shadow. It also has to cross over the Great Central Valley of California. It is then squeezed over the Sierra Nevada mountains, which in this area is 9,000 to 10,000 feet high. This rapid and dramatic rise in elevation squeezes most of the moisture out, which causes it to fall as rain on the windward or western side of the Sierra Nevadas. That colder, drier air then sinks down the leeward eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada mountains, where it then has to rise over two additional mountain ranges, the Argus and Panamint ranges, before it reaches Death Valley, which sinks all the way down below sea level. Death Valley therefore sits in a quadruple rain shadow with the Coast Ranges, Sierra Nevada, Argus, and Panamint Mountains blocking the moisture from reaching the valley, which contributes to its extremely hot and extremely dry climate. They see less than 2 inches of rain a year in most years, and occasionally experience air temperatures over 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Death Valley occupies the transition zone between the Mojave Desert in the south and the Great Basin Desert in the north, which covers most of Nevada, parts of Oregon, and parts of eastern California and Utah. In deserts, physical weathering dominates. Despite the low annual rainfall in deserts, most erosion is caused by water. Unlike other environments, wind is also an important agent of erosion. If we look in this chart on the left of average temperature and average annual rainfall, we can see how that relates to weathering. For example, in the upper right, a tropical climate with wet, warm temperatures results in strong chemical weathering. Deserts, on the other hand, exist everywhere from extremely hot and extremely arid to extremely cold and extremely arid, and it is in this region of the chart that very slight weathering of any kind happens. So let's talk about erosion by water. Rather than streams and rivers, in deserts we have dry washes. In Arabic, these are called wadi, and in Spanish they are called arroyo. So whether they're called washes, wadi, or arroyo just depends on where in the world you are located. There is very low humidity and moisture, which means there's little to no soil on top of the bedrock. Very little soil means that rainwater can't really sink into the landscape and it runs off very rapidly. Lots of runoff during rain creates flash floods, which we can see in these two pictures below. We have the dry wash on the left, and then following a rainstorm, it is flowing with water. These streams are dry almost all of the time and only flow during the largest, heaviest rain events. Another important feature in desert landscapes that you actually see in almost any mountainous region, but are particularly well preserved in deserts, these features are called pediments and inselbergs. These are composed of eroded bedrock and resistant knobs of bedrock. If you have a mountain range, its lowest flanks will often be very flat and covered with alluvial sediment. That is just sediment transported by water that flows out of the mountains and across the landscape below. The thin layer of alluvium atop the bedrock is called the alluvial plain. Once in a while, areas of bedrock will poke up above that alluvial plain, and these are called inselbergs. Here are a couple of examples of inselbergs. On the left, from Joshua Tree National Park, we see these granite knobs sticking up above the alluvial plain that covers much of Joshua Tree National Park. These granite knobs are where the large, round boulders that are popular among rock climbers are usually found. On the right, we have one of the largest inselbergs anywhere in the world, Uluru, formerly known as Ayers Rock, in central Australia. This huge lump of bedrock sticks up above a very flat surrounding plain. The surrounding alluvial plain is part of a pediment structure, and Uluru itself is the inselberg, the area of bedrock poking up above the surrounding pediment. Water erosion in deserts also produces mesas and buttes, and frequently very steep cliffs. On the lower right, we see a tower from Monument Valley in Navajo Nation and Arizona, and this was formerly part of a huge band of cliffs that is located behind where the photographer was standing. These diagrams show that the rock layers were formerly continuous until water erosion removed the rocks, leaving behind these isolated buttes, spires, and mesas. A mesa is a large, flat-topped area with very steep cliffs. A butte is just a small mesa. These are products of differential erosion. Staying in Monument Valley, which is a tribal park of the Navajo Nation in Arizona and Utah, we can see that the differential erosion is what has shaped this particular butte. On the bottom of this butte, we have the Organ Rock Shale, which is a soft mudstone with occasional layers of sandstone, but it's mostly a soft shale. Then we have this tall vertical-sided section, which is the Decelli Sandstone, which is a very hard rock and forms cliffs all throughout the desert southwest. Above that, we have another sloping section, which is created by the Moenkopi Formation, which is another soft shale siltstone with some layers of sandstone. On the very top of this butte, we have another hard layer with vertical, actually overhanging sides. This is called the Shinarump Conglomerate, and it is a very hard rock that caps this stack of sedimentary rocks. Water erosion in this valley has steadily removed the areas of the Organ Rock Shale. The water is able to easily erode this soft rock, and over very long periods of time has removed enormous lateral sections of this rock, which undercuts the overlying harder rocks and causes the valley to widen over long periods of time, leaving behind these occasional buttes in the middle of the landscape. So we've covered erosion by water. Now we're going to talk about deposition by water. The ultimate sink for most sediments in the desert is a playa, or dry lake bed. The surfaces of these dry lake beds are often cracked, and you can see these distinctive polygonal mud cracks on this image from the racetrack playa in Death Valley National Park on the upper right. On the lower left, you can see just how flat this dry lake bed surface is. It actually deviates about less than 4 inches from one side to the other, which is about 2 miles across. You'll note that in this picture in the upper right, there is a rock with apparently a trail extending behind it. This is the famous lake bed in Death Valley where the rocks seem to move across the playa surface. So let's talk about that. The racetrack playa indeed has a lot of rocks on its surface that do leave behind trails in the mud. So the rocks do actually move across the surface of the lake bed. This playa exists at fairly high altitude, about 3,700 feet, and in the winter it does receive some snowfall and rainfall. This rainfall and snowfall occasionally results in a very shallow lake on the south end of the playa, where most of the rocks are. Rocks that tumble off of the mountainside or are delivered by flash floods end up at the edges of the playa. As this temporary lake freezes, rocks get surrounded by these huge ice sheets. The high winds that are frequent in this area blow these thin sheets of ice around and across the flat playa surface, dragging the rocks with them, leaving behind these trails in the mud that can extend for hundreds of yards. Rocks that move range in size from golf ball to several large boulders that are sitting several hundred yards out from the edge of the playa in the middle of this lake bed. Playas deposit certain kinds of sediments that are well preserved in the geologic record. Usually these consist of silt and clay with minor areas of sand near the edges of your playa deposit. We can see the thin laminations with occasional very thin layers of sand in this very ancient playa deposit in the upper right. These very fine laminations reflect different episodes of deposition, so that would be a period where the playa contains water or recently had sediment delivered to it by floods. On the lower left, we can see some of the sedimentary structures common associated with playas, and these include ripples, which we can see on this surface, and mud cracks, also very common in playa deposits. Occasionally, layers of something we call evaporite minerals, which I'll talk about shortly, such as gypsum or salt, are present in between the layers of mud. These thin, needle-like minerals in the image on the lower right are gypsum, found in between layers of playa deposits of silt and clay. Evaporite minerals are found on features called salt flats or salt pans. The rare rainwater that falls across the landscape dissolves ions into it, which we've already discussed in the lecture on chemical sediments. So your rainwater, which is mildly acidic, will dissolve calcium, sodium, silica, potassium, lithium, etc. from the rocks on the landscape. Death Valley and many lakes in the area of the United States called the Great Basin have no outlet to the sea, so all of the water from the surrounding region ends up in the bottom of the valley, around the playa. The water containing the dissolved minerals has nowhere to go but up, so over time it evaporates, and the minerals that were formerly dissolved in it are left behind. That forms this solid crust of salt and other minerals on the surface of the playa. This forms a solid salt crust that we call the salt pan. In Death Valley, this salt pan is called the Badwater Basin, which is 282 feet below sea level. So it's extremely low altitude and extremely arid, and no water that enters this basin can escape to the ocean. The drainage area of Death Valley is actually very large. The valley itself is about 120 miles long from north to south and up to 20 miles wide. But at the south end, a mostly dry river enters from Nevada, and that incorporates a very large drainage basin as well. During the rare times when that river contains water, all of the dissolved minerals from this entire landscape are delivered to the salt pan in the bottom of Death Valley, as well as the groundwater from an enormous region of central Nevada that isn't shown on this map. All of that groundwater eventually makes its way to the floor of Death Valley, where it evaporates and deposits more salt. On the bottom we can see a period of time when the Badwater Basin contains a rare lake. As of the time of this recording, a lake is present on the floor of Death Valley in February of 2026, and as it evaporates, it too is depositing more salt onto the salt pan of the Badwater Basin. The deposits of salt pans include clay and silt, as well as copious amounts of rock salt and gypsum, and other evaporite minerals, minerals that are formed from evaporating water. We often see these deposits in rift valleys and inland seas, both of which often accumulate vast amounts of evaporites. On the top right, we can see some very freshly deposited salt that I took from the last time I was in Death Valley when there was a temporary lake in 2024. The edge of this lake contained these very fine threads of salt. These are pure salt crystals that are growing out of the muddy floor of the valley. They are all aligned with the direction of the dominant wind, which is interesting. Another very important deposit you'll find in deserts is an alluvial fan. This is a fan-shaped deposit of gravel, boulders, and sand that gets deposited at the mouth of a canyon. These are the products of countless flash floods that deliver sediment from the mountains to the mouth of the canyon and the floor of the valley. These fans are usually crossed by numerous dry washes across its surface that deliver sediment to the valley floor when they flow with water. Inside the canyon, your flash flood is a very confined, very concentrated, very energetic flow. These intense, energetic flows are able to carry surprisingly large amounts of sediment, including cobbles and boulders. As your wash exits the canyon and spreads out across the fan, those larger grains are deposited up at the higher portions of your alluvial fan. So the tops of your alluvial fan will contain more cobbles and boulders, and as you go towards the valley floor, you will move through regions of gravel and eventually silt and sand at the downslope, downstream edge of the alluvial fan. Alluvial fan deposits usually contain conglomerate or breccia, and they often contain boulders, cobbles, gravel, and sand. They are often largely unsorted with a wide mix of different grain types, grain sizes, and varying degrees of roundness, depending on how far these grains have traveled. On the top image, you can faintly see the different layers in this alluvial fan deposit that reflect individual flash floods that deposited sediment on the surface of the alluvial fan. When you get a lot of alluvial fans that sort of coalesce and form a single low-lying, low-relief surface at the foot of the mountains, you get what's called a bajada. And these are just alluvial fans that have grown to overlap each other and create a broad, sloping surface between the valley floor and the mountains. The western side of Death Valley contains a large and extensive bajada along the foot of the mountains. The final type of desert water deposit we're going to talk about is called desert varnish. This is a dark coating of manganese and iron oxides that form thin layers on some rocks. The exact formation behind desert varnish is a poorly understood process. It could be partly due to microorganisms or some kind of chemical weathering process. We don't fully understand the reasoning behind desert varnish, but it does often produce these types of streaks on dry rock surfaces, like we can see in the left in Capitol Reef National Park in Utah. It's very common in Death Valley, particularly on alluvial fan surfaces, and is often a place where Native Americans would have carved carvings called petroglyphs. The thin layers of desert varnish, which you can see a thin section of under a microscope up above, is easily pecked away and reveals the unweathered, unvarnished rock beneath it. The amount of desert varnish that is accumulated on rocks or surfaces can indicate the age of that surface. Desert varnish is easily removed or doesn't accumulate when a rock is often being moved and tumbled by water action, and it takes a really long time to accumulate in the first place. So a rock with more desert varnish has been exposed for a longer period of time. On the right, we can see an alluvial fan in Death Valley. This is from Grotto Canyon. And in the center, we have the gray wash, where most flash floods are sending their water and sediment. These gray areas are the places where water most often actively flows and does not accumulate desert varnish. On the sides of the gray wash, though, we can see slightly elevated alluvial surfaces that are darker in color. And these darker surfaces are older surfaces, sometimes hundreds of thousands, occasionally up to 1,000,000 years old in this area. Now we're going to move on to wind erosion and deposition. The low humidity, little vegetation, and frequent high winds make wind a significant erosion and deposition factor in desert environments. High winds will suspend and carry sediment such as clay, silt, and sand, and move it along the ground. The suspended sediment inside the wind, which is the sediment floating in the air, is often very abrasive and hurts a lot when it gets into your eyes. On the floor of the desert, heavier grains of sand bounce or roll along the surface. Bouncing grains do an action called saltation. This bounce and fall and bounce and fall is called saltation, and is also a process that happens in streams. Grains are also rolling along the surface of the ground, which is another process that happens in streams. The most significant kind of wind erosion is called deflation. This is the lowering of an area of land by wind removing sediment. This creates features called deflation hollows or blowouts. On the upper right, we can see an area of landscape deflation where plants, this is a plant called arrowweed, has been left behind on this tall pedestal of dirt as the surrounding material has been eroded away or deflated by the wind. This area of the park is called the desert cornfield, and it's a very weird landscape with these tall plants growing on these weird pedestals. Below that, we can see a plant that is located in a blowout hollow, or a deflation hollow, where the wind has moved away the sediment from the plant, leaving it in a sort of indented hole. Another feature of wind erosion is called desert pavement. This also happens in conjunction with water erosion, but there's usually more wind than water in the deserts, so this is generally a wind process. When your flash flood originally deposits sediment on the surface of your alluvial fan, it contains lots of sand and silt and clay. Over time, wind and water will slowly deflate the surface, removing the silt and clay, and leaving behind only your coarser, heavier grains, and creating this surface of interlocking, overlapping clasts that we call desert pavement. These are usually very good surfaces to walk on. Some somewhat uncommon features of desert erosion are called ventifacts, and ventifact is the featured word for this lecture. A ventifact is any rock that has been sculpted or faceted by the action of wind-carried sediment. Literally, these rocks have been sandblasted. That creates these nice flat or round edges and is a product of wind-driven sediment mechanically abrading the edges of these rocks. Both of these are from Death Valley below, where ventifacts are very common in some areas. Another feature of wind erosion is a bizarre thing called a yardang. These are usually large-scale, streamlined ridges carved by wind abrasion. They tend to sort of resemble an upside-down boat shape and are usually wider in the windward side and taper downwind. In the middle left, we can see these alternating layers of harder and softer rock. The wind removes the softer rock more easily, leaving behind the long, streamlined ridges called yardangs. On the lower left is one in Texas. On the lower right is one in the Mojave Desert at Edwards Air Force Base. And above that on the right is one that sort of looks like a sphinx found in Egypt. Now we're going to move from erosion into deposition of wind. The most important feature of wind deposition are sand dunes. A sand dune is a large pile of sand that has been deposited by wind. Sand is delivered to the valley floor by water erosion and to some degree wind erosion, where it is then easily moved around by high winds. The movement of wind-blown sand creates a shallow, gentle-sloped surface, as well as a steeper surface called the slip face. The sand grains will saltate and roll uphill with the direction of the wind, forming a nice big pile. They will then slip or collapse down the leeward side of the sand dune, leaving behind a layer. Repeated action of this movement and collapse of sand creates a cross-bedded surface. The large cross-beds you can see in the Navajo sandstone in Zion National Park, for example, are the result of massive sand dunes. In these pictures, we can see different crossbeds in sand dune formations, including one in an active dune on the lower right, where you can see the crossbedding exposed when this sand dune was dug into. The shape of your sand dune depends on variations in wind direction and sediment supply. There are 5 main types of sand dunes with different shapes and morphology. All 5 of these dune types can be found in Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve in Colorado. Almost all of them can be found in Death Valley's 7 individual sand dune fields, but there are a few that aren't usually found in Death Valley that are found in Great Sand Dunes and to a lesser extent in White Sands National Park in New Mexico. So let's look at the types of sand dunes. The different types of sand dunes include Barken, Star, Transverse, Parabolic, and longitudinal or saif dunes. A Barken dune is the most basic type of sand dune. They form these small crescent shapes that move across the landscape with the direction of the wind. Barken is Arabic for horns, and the shape of these sand dunes sort of looks like the horns on a cow or a goat, thus the name. The arms or horns of these dunes point in the direction of the wind, and they migrate relatively rapidly across the landscape. Transverse dunes generally form in areas of one primary wind direction with a large sand supply. These are basically just Barken dunes that are all merged together into one single long ridge. On the lower left, we can see some of the ones you find on the floor of Death Valley, these long, linear ridges of sand that move across the landscape over time with the primary wind direction. And you can see some along a coast. I'm not sure where this is, on the lower right. Remember, the gentle slope of the sand dune is on the windward side, so the wind in this lower right photograph generally moves from right to left. Longitudinal dunes are somewhat uncommon. These are found in areas with 2 primary directions of wind that are similar, and also with a large sand supply. In the diagram on the upper left, you can see that the primary wind directions are, well, they generally come from one side, but they may vary slightly in direction, which basically moves the sand into long, linear piles rather than crescent or ridge-shaped piles. These form generally parallel to the dominant wind direction. These are rather uncommon. There are only a few of them in Great Sand Dunes National Park, and I'm not sure of any known in Death Valley. Star dunes are fairly common. They are formed by more than 2 dominant wind directions. On the upper left, you can see how the multiple different wind directions drive the sand up into a sort of pile with multiple ridges extending from its summit. We can see a couple of examples here, all from Death Valley. This one on the right is in the Mesquite Flat sand dunes, and we can see the sharp ridges all merging at the summit of this sort of square-shaped star dune. Next up, we have parabolic dunes. These form in areas with one dominant wind direction, with the flanks anchored by vegetation. These dune forms are very similar to Barcan dunes, except they curve in the opposite direction. With a Barcan dune, the arms or tails of your sand dune point downwind. In a parabolic dune, the tails or arms of your sand dune have been stabilized by vegetation. And this holds the very edges of the sand dune back and creates long ridges trailing behind the active sand dune, which is migrating in the wind direction. These occasionally form downslope of blowouts or wind-blown hollows. Both of these examples are from Great Sand Dunes National Park. So why do sand dunes form where they do? Well, they're usually found in areas where winds slow and that causes them to drop out all their sediment. They also exist in areas with high sand supplies and areas with very scarce vegetation, although vegetation can accumulate sand around its base. The Great Sand Dunes in Colorado are located there because there's a large ancient lake bed, which is the source of sediment, that winds blow around and push up against the foot of the Sangre de Cristos Mountains. These dunes are the tallest in North America at over 750 feet tall. Death Valley also has some very tall sand dunes. Pictured here in the lower right are the Eureka Dunes in the remote northwest edge of the national park, and they themselves are about 700 feet tall above the surrounding desert floor. In summary, we have talked about mesas and buttes, which are erosional features, wadi or washes, which are the dry stream beds occasionally washed by flash floods, alluvial fans, which are the depositional result of water erosion in deserts, salt pans or playas, which are the sites of former or occasional lake beds. We've talked about pediments, where sediment is deposited on the flanks of buttes or mountains, and sand dunes, where the dry desert sediment is blown around and deposited by the action of the wind. This has been the lecture on desert landscapes featuring Death Valley National Park.